Hello and welcome back to another video talking about the particular subject of why the debt matters. Now, the national debt seems like a bogus issue and a fourth-rate plank issue, but the fact is that our debt is an ever-increasingly big problem in our economy that will only get worse with time. This is a black-pilled video, okay? So I'm going to tell you up front what we're going to do here. Now, as you can see, the debt is at $26.6 trillion and it's going to get worse. We are looking at a debt per citizen of $80,000 or a debt poor taxpayer $213,000. So if you pay taxes, the national debt to be paid off, you would have to pay $214,000 a year. We are at a $2.8 trillion deficit, and our debt in 2000 under Bill Clinton was 56%, and now we're at 136% of GDP to debt ratio. So what this means is that if we make $20 trillion a year and our debt is $26 trillion, that means that we owe like 36% more than what we make a year. So clearly revenue is going up, the spending is going up at a higher rate if you look at these charts, and clearly we're having decreased revenues as well with higher spending. And you can see the interest rate costs a lot of money as well. So for example, our interest rate right now is right at this bubbling point where it's like $380 billion, but just give it 10 years and we're going to be at $800 billion interest, okay? So the interest on the debt is going to go up by twice. So imagine if your credit card debt just increased twice in interest, you're going to die. So that is what is going on. And then when you look at GDP growth, we've had a good growth, but the spending goes up higher. So this is a big problem. So look at this. Debt held by the public. You can see just how high it is compared to what it was under the end of Bush. Look, 35% versus now where it's like 80%. So the debt owned by households is kind of awful as well. So those are 11 charts. And then when we look at the history of the federal debt, you can see that the debt, even compared to the economy, is going up no matter how you slice it. And there's no discernible going down, basically. So there's no V in here. And there's no spike towards the top too much. Just that if you look under Obama and Bush, it went up very hard. And it just hasn't stopped under Trump, which is unfortunate, but that's what happens. When you look at the debt, of course, it goes up. It used to be 4 trillion under Bush, second term. 2018, first term Trump, we're already at 12 trillion in terms of public debt. Then the government holds debt on its own. It segregates it, okay? We look at what we're spending on as of 2008, you can see what we're doing, and it's a very confusing amount of government agencies that we have to deal with. So it's clearly too complicated for an easy fix. This is why people don't care. It's because it doesn't affect them right now. But let me tell you, yes, it does. You can see these spikes in the debt. Look, it spiked in like 1940. Then you can see it coming back nowadays, even though we're not in a World War II scenario. So that's clearly a big problem. And because we hold on to the debt, we are paying interest where we don't necessarily have to. So look at the debt of all the countries, and if you look at the bottom, this is basically our debt, okay? So like a huge chunk, it's China. That's who owns our debt in large chunk. But look at all the different countries that own our debt. And basically, when we borrow money today and get lended it by China, we're letting them control us more than we're controlling them. As an example, they have more of our debt than we have of theirs, meaning they have about $3 trillion of our debt in their possession, whereas they have approximately billions, okay, but not trillions. Now look at the interest payments on the debt. Our interest payments are only 2%, but 2% of a big debt gets bigger and bigger eventually. So when you look at here, the net interest payments are going up consistently almost no matter what. So look at this. We were paying next to nothing. In 1970, we were paying not even a percent of the economy in debt. But now in 2019, not even in COVID times, we are looking at a net interest of 9%, okay? So it's spiking really hard. And we are spending approximately $400 billion a year. Now, this is out of a budget of $4 trillion. So 10% of our budget, 9.6% exactly, is spent on the debt, meaning that instead of spending $400 billion, that could give everybody a stimulus of $1,000. Okay, by the way, if you literally gave every single person in this country $1,000, that would be less than what would be spent on the interest on our debt. That's how important. So if we got rid of the debt, the government could just give you $1,000 and it'd be better off fiscally, okay? So again, net interest as a percent of GDP never exceeded 3% really. Up until this point, 2020, we're going over 3. You can see that arrow going straight up almost, or diagonal, sorry. And then you look even under Obama, and you can see the debt increasing in general in terms of it building foundationally, okay? Now, you can cut interest rates, but when you cut interest rates, the point is to juice up the economy. So if we're ever in a recession, and because we have so much debt, we have negative interest rates, you can't go any further than 0, basically. Well, should anyway. So because of the coronavirus, we're like an extra $2 trillion in debt, which is a huge problem. And when you look over here, we're at a net revenue of $2.3 trillion. And it's thankfully picking up, but the fact is that we used to be at like 3.8 trillion or 3.5 or something. So we've lost a good chunk of the revenue. And while everything is coming back to normal, the debt is still going up faster than it was before. So when you look in 2024 as a projected amount, our debt is freaking enormous. It's approximately like easily almost double, so 45 trillion. So I don't think it'll be this bad, but that's like if everything stayed the same. If we stayed in the the Democrats want to lock down, and this is what's going to happen if we're in a lockdown 4 years from now, hypothetically. That's not going to happen, but still, 45 trillion in debt, spending as high as ever, the deficit double what it is now almost. You look at a revenue that is increasing, but the federal tax revenue is going down to the point where our debt is rocketing, whereas our income is going down. So that means that the net interest on the debt goes up another 10%. The GDP debt rate is like 40% higher or 35% higher. So that's a problem. And clearly you just can't go on with this. 10 million unemployed. That would happen. That would happen if we let things go on with the lockdown. So that's why I care so much about the lockdown, not because I'm in my room, not because I'm home all day, but also this debt that we cannot fix without working hard, okay? Now, I mean, look at the debt, look at this chart. It's completely confusing, and I understand. People don't get it. The layman does not get it. But when you look at charts simple as this, interest rates, rockets way up, okay? Rockets under Carter, Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, whoever. But still, and even your phony baloney 0% interest rates in the Great Recession era didn't fix anything at all. That's my problem with this administration, is that it believes that somehow the zero interest rates are a good long-term solution, but when you look at the deficits, you just cannot explain them, okay? That's common knowledge. Now, I can show you more graphs, but should I keep on going? This is just the Wikipedia, okay? This is just scratching the surface, okay? This would take you 20 minutes to go across. But look at the foreign holders of U.S. Treasury, okay? So Japan has $1.2 trillion of our money. China has over $1 trillion. And this is a little old data, okay? But the point is that they own a lot of us. Even Switzerland owns $240 billion of our money. And this cannot keep on going. Okay? So if you look at gross debt in terms of GDP, you have the United States getting worse and worse. Okay? Russia is only at 20% debt. Okay? But when you look at a country such as the U.S., we are number 5 in terms of debt to GDP, basically. The only countries that are worse are Italy, which is screwed, Greece, which is dying, and Japan, which is really, really, really dying. And one country that's popular for interest rates being really low is Japan. And Japan's negative interest rates nets them a 236% debt. So they didn't fix it, okay? So when you do zero interest rates, it doesn't fix the debt at all. It just helps you kick the can down the road, okay? That's clearly the thing. So this is a huge, huge, huge deal. And all these people can spend all they want, but it's not going to be enough to fix anything at all, right? So that's what it is. Then when we look at other charts, look at the debt again. This is just this year, okay? So look at the debt as it was in October or January, even January, pre-COVID. You're looking at $23 trillion debt. Debt went up $3 trillion just now. Then look at 5 years. So we're looking at the end of Obama to Trump. All this line up until this point, ignore the skyrocketing amount because of COVID. That's not Trump's fault. But when you look at these, it still goes up under our president, the Republican president. And then when you look at the 10-year span, Obama increased it, of course. When you look at the 25-year span, Bush increased it a little bit. Obama increased it a lot, and Trump has increased it a little bit. So when you look at the full map, you can really see things go insane with Obama. Look, 2010, it just skyrockets. It's kind of pathetic to see our country in this rate. Okay, look at debt to GDP. Look at debt to GDP. Under Trump, 106. Debt to GDP went up 30%. Okay? And then when we look at the deficit that we've had under Obama, 9% budget deficit, 8.5%, 7%, 4%, 3%, 2%, 3%, 3.5%, 4.5% under Trump. So this is what you get when you do too many debts, okay? And most have not been balanced. Most budgets have not been balanced. In fact, there was a little time in the 90s and the early 2000s where it balanced. But other than that, it hasn't since like 1970 or like 1968. That's what happens when you increase the debt without growing the economy or raising taxes or doing something of the both, okay? So even looking at the debt to GDP ratio, you can look that even the New Deal increased the debt all the way from 39% to about over here in 1940 to 42%. And how did he keep the debt low? He increased taxes a lot, but that made the depression last longer. So the answer is not raising taxes, of course. So let's look at a time when cutting taxes worked. Look, Kennedy cut taxes for the rich from 90% to 70%. That lowered the debt to GDP from 49 to, by the end of Johnson, let's say, was 37%. Then when we look at Nixon kept taxes more or less the same, and he lowered the debt to GDP. He didn't lower the debt. You see how the numbers go up, but yet it goes down as a percentage because our economy is growing faster. If you want to think about it this way, if the government spends like an extra 3% a year in GDP, the economy needs to grow over that amount to lower the deficit, or at least lower the debt relative to the economy, okay? So, for example, if you had the economy in 1971 at $400 billion in debt, and you just balanced the budget from then on, and you just said, we're keeping the debt at $400 billion, by now, that would only be like 0.5% of our economy, or let's say 4% of our economy. And we would pay that off really easy. So, in fact, that's what goes in. So, balancing the budget is incredibly important. When you look at the Reagan tax cut, Reagan started off at 31%. And basically, through his huge tax cuts and military spending, he increased the debt to 50%. Okay? So notice here, 31% to 50%, 20% increase. But look at the debt. The debt was $1 trillion under Reagan when he started. And the debt went all the way up to almost $3 trillion. So the debt tripled, but relative to the economy, it only went up 20%. That goes to a testament of how cutting taxes and cutting regulations under Reagan helped with the deficit long term. And I can tell you why, and that's because him cutting taxes to the rich and to others basically produced a job market and a growth rate that supplanted the debt level to the extent to which it was justifiably getting into debt. Okay? So the economy got a lot bigger, and it did get a lot more in debt, but not as much as you would think. And if you had raised taxes, it would have been worse. Okay? Then you look at the budget under Clinton. Clinton walks in, 64% debt. He goes out with a really good economy, okay? He cuts taxes a little bit, and he raises them a little bit, so we'll call that 50-50. But then we'll look at the great debt through the economic bubble of the 90s, and the debt goes down back to 55% by the end of Clinton, by 9/11. So he decreases the debt by 10%. Now notice that the debt does increase from $4.4 trillion to 5.8. But since the economy grew so much, the debt decreased by 10%. And in part, that's because of the Reagan tax cuts, okay? So notice, most of the Clinton surplus was not because of Clinton being a Democrat and Democrats are better with the budget, which is BS, but the fact is that the Reagan tax cuts with the computer boom let him do this, and the Republicans controlled the Congress, and they repealed Glass-Steagall, and they did welfare reform, etc. So that's what happened. And then Bush starts out with $6.2 trillion in debt, 57% debt to GDP, and by the end he's at 68. Okay, so right at the recession he was at 68. He increased the debt by 13%. Now, how do you do this? He did it because of a lot of things, but part of it was the Iraq War. If you look at the interest and the debt in the Iraq War, if you combine the wars in the Middle East plus the interest on the debt that I'm warning you guys against, he would be balancing the budget. So that's his problem, okay? But Bush didn't really increase the budget other than the war. And even still, he didn't balance the budget. So that's a problem. So that's not supply side. And yes, he did cut taxes, but that increased growth. So that's a BS argument too. Cutting, it might sound oxymoronic, but cutting taxes does help the debt eventually. Now, when we look at Obama, he started off at 83% debt because the debt went up 20% basically because of the bailout. And because of that bailout, we are at 95% debt or 99% under Obama, and he himself, even with the Republicans trying to help them sequester and to slow down growth of government, all he does is raises the debt ceiling, and all he does is increase the debt all the way to 104%, which is his fault, okay? If you look at after 2010, sure, there's a recession, but he did not cut the government either, not by his own will at least. And if it weren't for the Republicans, the debt would be like 10% higher. So look at this. So we're down to Donald Trump. Donald Trump walked in on 103%. Now he ended up in 2019 with 106%. So the debt went up 3% in 3 years. So you can see under Trump, the debt has grown at a slower rate than Obama and Bush ever could. And so he's mediocre on the debt, I would say. But he increases defense to almost $1 trillion, and yet the debt barely goes up at all as a percentage of GDP. And that goes to show that the Trump economy was really good pre-COVID, right? But because of this, the CARES Act, etc., this increases the debt like crazy. Just like how the Great Depression spending increased the debt a lot, the World War II military spending increased the debt a lot. So that's what happened. Also, he did the Trump tax cuts, and contrary to popular opinion, he cut taxes for the middle class as well as the rich, but the rich got a bigger tax cut because the more money you make, the bigger a tax cut will be. As an example, if you make $1 trillion and you get a 1% tax cut, then you save $10 billion, right? But if I make $100,000 and get a 1% tax cut, I only save $1,000. You say, well, the billionaire or the trillionaire got the bigger tax cut. It's like, no, we got the same. Just that because he has more, the percentage is bigger. Or the percentage is the same, but the amount is bigger. So that's a qualitative assessment rather than a quantitative one, which is what the Democrats ridicule the Republican tax cuts with. So, of course, the debt went down. So if you're making if you're making more than $10,000 a year, your taxes went down. Okay? That's just the fact. That is the fact. Now, let's look at the growth. And the growth under the Donald Trump plan, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, basically increased the growth by 0.7% a year. That was the estimate by the CBO, and the CBO was wrong, and it was actually higher, meaning that the debt to GDP percentage points was approximately okay, so 7% of economic growth after 10 years on an economy which is $22 trillion is approximately, let's look at the data, it's like $1.8 trillion, okay? And that's not including compound interest, meaning that the Trump tax cuts got us $1.8 trillion in economic growth in exchange for like $1.7 trillion in tax cuts, or $2 trillion in tax cuts. And that's not including the growth after 10 years. So basically how it works is that the government only thinks in 10-year long terms and nothing else. So as an example, the debt incurred pays for itself through economic growth after 11 years or 8 years or whatever that is. So the point is that yes, the tax cuts do pay for themselves, and yes, it does reduce the deficit over time, which is why the Reagan tax cuts increased the debt 20% as a proportion to GDP, but with those same tax cuts in place for the most part, Clinton was able to reduce the debt by 10% and balance the budget after. And that's clearly with an increasing amount of spending, because the economic growth in correspondence to the tax cuts and deregulatory reform helped the economy catch up with the debt. So that's what happens. And this is all in accordance to the Laffer chart, okay? Which means if you tax it 100%, nobody's going to work because the government takes all their money. So in communism, they have poor economies, in part because people are lazy and they don't want to work if they have the option, because all their money is going to be taken. So that's completely prohibitive. And then when you look at a tax rate of 0%, well, obviously you're not getting any money. So if the tax rate is over 50%, then and you cut it to under 50, it'll definitely help. But if it's under 50 and you cut the taxes, it may or may not help. So that's why there's a debate. Okay, and that's why the Democrats cut the taxes when it was over 50% for the rich. Okay, now let's look at the GDP growth. GDP growth of the world was is higher than ours, which is why their debt isn't as bad as ours. Okay, that's another chart I wanted you to look at. Then when we look at Ronald Reagan, you can see that he had to work with the Democratic Congress the entire time he was president, even though he won big elections. But the fact is that under Reagan, yes, we did increase the debt, but when we look at inflation, it went down. The price of oil basically went down, and things got typically better. And because of the better economy, we were able to get out of stagflation after a recession that lasted a year or two. And honestly, the Reagan deficits mainly come from the fact that the Congress didn't really stop spending money. So the exchange was, you get these big tax cuts, Reagan, but us Democrats will continue to spend what we want, where Reagan in his own head wanted tax cuts plus to cut spending like whatever you want, welfare or abortion or whatever you want to cut out of the budget that are like really simple. So that's what it is. That's really, really good information to know. So look at the big spikes in GDP. We're looking at approximately 3%. And then, of course, there's a recession, but it bounces back to 5%, to 7%, to 4%, to 4%, to 4%, to 4%. So solid growth overall under Reagan. And you can see that the unemployment rate after the recession went down. So the unemployment rate got to about 5% at the peak of 11%. And his Democratic predecessor left him at 8%. So he decreased unemployment by like 40%. And of course, the wages go down because of immigration and other things, but that's not as a result of the tax cuts. And in fact, tax cuts increase the rate of wage growth, of course, because you're giving more money to to the employer. Okay. Yeah, so look at the GDP growth. Bush was better than Obama. Of course, the recession screws it. George H.W. Bush was faster than Obama. The Reagan was faster than Obama and Bush and the other Bush. Clinton was faster than Reagan, and that was mainly because of this was mainly because Clinton had the economic boom that Reagan didn't have in terms of the computer sector. Also, he had lower taxes than Reagan did in a lot of respects. So that's why a lot of leftists call Clinton the continuation of the Reagan policies, because that's what it was. And then on to one of the last things. Yes, you can defend the Reagan deficits, and yes, you can explain a lot of it with the military spending on the Republican side. And President Reagan didn't spent $3 trillion on defense. And why did he spend another $800 billion over 8 years? And that's partially because he wanted to defeat the Soviet Union and they went bankrupt and we didn't. And that's the key point, right? And also, I mean, honestly, this is how important it is. Now, to cap off the video, yes, we do have big deficits and it does not help us. And clearly, it's going to get worse and we do need to fix it. And I can tell you exactly why. We look at this, 26 trillion. That's insane. Now, when we look at the other charts, of course, I'm vindicated over and over again. And when we look at the 2019 budget, which was the last normal year pre-COVID, we had 3.4 trillion in revenue. We are at 2.3 trillion in revenue. It is falling. Don't raise taxes, just open up the economy, of course. And don't blame Trump for the deficits, and I can tell you why. The Democrats control the Congress, and when the Republicans did control the Congress, it wasn't by a lot, number one. And we had a lot, and we did have a lot of rhinos. We had Paul Ryan as speaker, okay. That's like the chief rhino, right? And look at this. Donald Trump wanted to spend 1.305 trillion in discretionary, ended up spending 1.359 trillion, okay? So clearly he was asking for a smaller deficit and they didn't give it to him. And they still blast him for cutting Social Security and all that when he wasn't really that harsh on Social Security. So again, just completely retarded. And look, we were estimated that we would have a $3.7 trillion revenue rate in 2020 pre-COVID. Look at this, 2.3. Then we look at the deficit, $4.7 trillion budget. What is the budget now? 5.1 trillion. So where is the money coming from? Exactly, we're losing money and we're losing our power as well. Now, last thing before I go, nations do look. The debt does matter, and you cannot print money. And let me tell you really quick why. When you print money, there's no such thing as free money, and inflation is when you print money, basically. So when you print money, it makes all the other dollars less valuable than each other, as in, if everybody was a millionaire, it wouldn't be special. The typical person makes like 40 grand, let's say, or 60 grand a year. Now, 100 years ago, 60 grand would be crazy, and that's because we had less wealth. But if you just printed $1 million and now the average person makes $1 million, that means nothing because you just printed more money, okay? Which is why Bernie Sanders' proposals and the Democrats' proposals just don't make sense. Another thing is raising taxes does not help. What we need is a freer economy. Now look at what happens with the debt increasing. Now, the median growth rate of GDP falls by 1%, and the average growth falls even more. Okay, so basically, when we reach 90% of debt to GDP, and we're at 136, the amount of growth goes down by 1%, meaning that we're growing like 1% slower than we should be if we didn't have the debt there. Meaning that 1% of GDP is $220 billion. So every year we're losing $220 billion in opportunity cost because we're paying the debt, and we're paying China the debt, and we're paying Russia the debt, etc. And then we're going to spend like $340 billion on the debt. So we're spending $500 billion a year on the debt that didn't have to be there, basically. Okay? Which is why we need to balance the budget. And any good Republican would tell you that. And I'm not going to take this BS of we need distributism, we need to tax the rich. Taxing the rich would just increase unemployment and increase the amount of firings in the smaller businesses, and we'd just be killed by China anyway. What we need is a robust economy, an open economy, a free market economy. And sure, we do need some tariffs, but really, the fact is, leftist economics are cancer. And you can see that. The Democrats increase the debt, and the Republicans increase the debt too. But what we need is fiscal conservatives for real. That means cutting taxes. That means cutting spending. Okay? That's obvious. The debt is a really pressing issue, guys, and I hope you understand it. And I'm done with this video. Goodbye.